Good day, I'm Vincent Saxtetter, and this is the After the Age of Fire channel. This is episode 47, recorded May 30th, 2026. The title is The Modern Return to Slavery. I'm saying that slavery is endemic around the world, and I'll be discussing how that happened and the different kinds of slavery that, however, don't look like what we see in the textbooks, but they're just modern reinventions of slavery. I should apologize to start with. There's some noise outside this apartment that I can't control, and so you'll be hearing the moving going on. Hopefully it won't be too disturbing. This is a prepping channel. It's prepping to help you and your family line flourish and thrive and reproduce during this transition between two eras in the human race. We're ending an era in which the human race was doubling its consumption of just about everything every 22 years. That's the total consumed by the human race. And we're transitioning into an era where those doublings won't be happening anymore, and we'll have a little bit less energy than we do now. Right now, averaging over the whole human race, we consume about 46,000 calories of energy from coal, oil, and gas. Most of that, 41,000 from coal, oil, and gas, and another 5,000 or so from what we call renewables, for a total of 46,000 calories, plus another 15,000 calories from things that we grow, food, fodder, and wood. So the total is around 60,000, and in the coming era, we'll be consuming more like 30,000 per person per day, 30,000 calories, around there. And if you want to know the logic behind that, how we can know that, just review, say, episodes 11 through 38 of this channel, where I go through every source of energy, its cost, the difficulties of using it, and how much we're likely to build and use. So that was actually the first section of this channel's content up through episode 38 was about that, about the energy that we have available long term, and also about our doublings, our exponential growth over the last 250 years. And now we're starting with episode 39, we're in the section of this channel's content that's about the transition, where we are today, how to recognize the transition, and are we already in it between the two eras. And then there will be a third section of this channel's content, which is about the coming era and what it will be like, what we can know about what it will be like, and how to prepare for it. So just to review where we've been so far in this second section about the transition. First episode 39 said that easy coal, easy gas, and easy oil will not run out overnight. They'll take generations to run out. So it's not like one day we'll have energy and the next day we won't. It would be more like it'll be 25 years to see a big difference, and then over 50 years it will become scarce, and after 100 years it'll be really scarce. There will still be some always, but it'll take time. So we're in a transition, or we're about to begin a transition that will take some time, but it's coming. It's not going to happen overnight. Then in episodes 40 through 42, I talked about mathematical patterns that this transition could follow. Overall, we're something like a stunt biker. In a situation like that, where a stunt biker goes off a ramp, he goes up a ramp for a while. That's like our exponential growth. At some point, he leaves the ramp and he's in thin air. He's still going up, but he's no longer supported. So his upward speed is decreasing, and eventually he will start to fall. And then the question is, will he have an abrupt collision with the ground after he falls far enough, or will there be a ramp to help him down? So for us, we're coming to the end of the exponential growth, or we've passed it. We may already be in something like free fall, um, and then how the patterns. I examined the patterns that we could follow on the way up, and then coming back down, and whether we're going to have an abrupt collision, or whether things might be smooth, or whether it might be bumpy. So that's episodes 40 through 42. In 43 and 44, I said I discussed that we won't. There's a lot of fear and foreboding that we might end the whole human race, and I just said there's no way we're going to do that. And I discussed in detail why not. So even though we clearly do have a death wish, we go to all sorts of effort to kill and kill and kill again. And then episodes 45 through 46, the last two episodes were about fake growth. So I said that it may seem that we're growing. Certainly we are consuming more energy each year, but it may be that this is somehow not the real thing, that we aren't getting anything for our, in fact we're getting worse and worse products, a worse and worse lifestyle, even though we're consuming more and more energy. And in particular, episode 46 was my first discussion really of geopolitics, and I expect to have a lot more discussion of geopolitics in coming episodes, but that's it. That's as much as I've done until now. It'll give you a taste of things to come. And now in episode 47, this episode is a follow-on to the previous episode about fake growth, and this episode is about modern slavery, the return to modern slavery. And overall, just to lay it out, a large fraction of the world population today lives in various forms of slavery or servitude. We think slavery is a thing of the past, but it's come back. So before I get into that in particular, let's give some background, just to tell you where I'm coming from, and then I'll tell you what I'm saying slavery is, and then I'll explain why I'm bringing up slavery now at this point in this channel. Then I'll tell you how slavery ended back in the 1800s, and then I'll go through the forms of slavery that are alive and well today, because it's come back. So, for some background, just to be clear, throughout most of human history, in most places, almost universally, people around the world have held slaves. It's just the rule, not the exception, that people hold slaves. There are many names and roles. There's a lot of variation. For instance, and there's a spectrum of slavery. Okay, for instance, there's something called being a servant. And I'm not talking about the one nowadays where you pay somebody to come in and help you out 40 hours a week or something. I'm talking about what servants were traditionally. Okay, and that's a soft version of slavery. And the versions of slavery change a lot from place to place and time to time. So you may have many words for it and not just many words, but many ways that it's done, many ways that it's lived, from place to place, and even in a particular place at a particular time, you may have different grades of servitude or slavery. So there's an awful lot of humans are very inventive. We find all sorts of ways of doing things. Just like we find, if left to ourselves, we find lots of languages and invent languages. So generally, when we think of slavery, we think in particular of this the kind of slavery that was practiced in the 1700s and 1800s, where tribes in Africa cooperated to enslave people and sell them to slave traders. And then European operated slave ships moved those slaves from Africa to North and South America, and they were probably sold again on arrival and then used for any number of tasks in North America and South America. And on the slave ships had horrible conditions. Often many people died on the way across the Atlantic. And then again in North and South America, there were often horrible conditions and many people died. And moreover, you didn't have right to have a family of your own. And if you did have children or a husband, your owner could always sell your husband or your wife or your children one by one. Okay. So that's a particular form of slavery, and this is the one that we tend to imagine when we think of slavery, but I'm saying that there are all sorts of other varieties of slavery, and this particular slave trade was one of the worst, one of the most inhuman, but there are many others that have a little softer edges, okay, but they're no less slavery. In general, or maybe I don't want to generalize too much, but often slaves got to retain their families. They had a residence of their own, and they had certain legal or else in practice rights. Maybe those rights were sometimes not kept. Okay, but there was a way of that practice, and sometimes even a legal code about how slaves should be treated. Okay, and more often than not, slaves and servant holders, slaveholders and servant holders thought that they were in the right, and society accepted their behavior as moral. Even the slaves often thought that the fact that they were owned and so on was moral. So I'm not approving of any of this. I'm not trying to make it look better than it is. Okay, I'm just saying, look, there's been an awful lot of it. Basically, every human society has done it, or at least most of them, and all around the world for thousands of years. And you know, it's just a fact, and it wasn't always as inhuman as the way that things were done in the African American slave trade. And I want to add one more proviso. It's when I say we are involved in slavery today, I am not saying something like you or I'm not addressing myself to slaveholders or to they or we or something like Adolf Hitler or something. I'm not saying we're the devil or something. Okay, I'm not saying that you're a slaveholder today is a bad man per se. I mean, I don't know. I'd have to know. Actually, God knows. I can't judge. Okay, but it's certainly a bad thing. Slavery is an evil thing. But there have been an awful lot of slaveholders through history, and many of them thought they were trying to do the right thing. So I can't say. The point here is not to express outrage or to judge or anything like that. I personally don't. I think it's wrong, and I don't like slavery at all, and I don't like any of the modern forms of slavery. They appall me, but that's not the point here. The point here is to discuss where we are in this transition between the old era, 250 years of exponential growth, much of which had no slavery, into another era where where already slavery is on its way back and flourishing, but in new forms, but we're going to have even more discussions about if we want to get rid of slavery again, we'll need to go through a lot of struggle for that too. Okay, the struggles aren't over. This is a perennial temptation for the human race to hold slaves or servants. Okay, and it will go on. We thought it was over. We thought we had accomplished this one. No, it's not. It's not accomplished. We're back to where we were. So let's, just to be clear, what is slavery? And again, as I mentioned before, there's a spectrum of forms of slavery and of inhumanities, and so I'll talk about some of the characteristics of slavery, and and you can have a soft slavery, and you can have a harsh slavery, and you can have one that's more inhuman than another. Okay, well, some of the things you can look for when you want to identify it is a loss of liberty and being told what to do and what not to do. Okay, being commanded. Another aspect of it is a loss of rights, of things that many people would consider to be their rights and their privileges. Okay. Another one is a dehumanization and a depersonalization, where certain people are treated as if they were objects. They are not humans. They're not persons. Okay. It means that someone who's a slave or perhaps a servant, or pick your word for it, is no longer a member of polite society. They're unable to look other people in the eye anymore. They can't. The handshake is not, a slave shaking the hand of someone in the owner class is not done. The slave is unable to form agreements or contracts. Okay, so they're excluded, they're ostracized. Another aspect of being a slave is being owned, being considered property, and having a money value, so that your value it could be written in dollars or in Chinese yen or whatever, in some currency. So those are some of the ways, some of the characteristics. So if you see this sort of thing happening in perhaps without the word slavery attached to it, you can think, oh, well, maybe this is a form of slavery, or somewhere on the way to slavery, somewhere on the spectrum. And there's a very good book by David Graeber called Debt, the First 5,000 Years, and it's a lot about debt and about money, but he also discusses slavery extensively, and he says that often, so I'll just say something from David Graeber. Often slavery is a consequence, in one way or another, of being so much in debt, so that's the title of his book, that your debt can never be repaid. Once your debt arrives at a point where you'll never be able to repay it, you or one of your family members is converted from being a person into an object. In other words, a slave. And once you have too much debt, you're no longer a person, or somebody maybe your daughter is no longer a person. So it is connected to how we think about money and debts. In modern times, working with your hands or with the land is felt to be a form of slavery. I don't think, perhaps we don't use the word exactly, okay, but it's certain that many people, especially people in the cities, but also many people who are just not very poor, have the same revulsion about working on the land or working with your hands that they feel about slavery. They feel like it's demeaning and revolting. Okay, they would almost die rather than have to do it themselves. An office job is far better than anything blue collar, especially anything when you're in the dirt. And farmers today often pride themselves on their machines, and they couldn't accept their lifestyle if they weren't being assisted by these machines. So that's what I'm talking about when I say forms of slavery. If you have a way of organizing things and you have people living in a certain way that matches some or all of these characteristics, then like cannot look a certain class of people in the eye, cannot enter into agreements with them, a loss of right and privileges compared to other people, or even being under legal restrictions so that your freedom of movement is restricted. These are all forms of slavery. So next, why am I talking about slavery now? I've been talking about energy and about all sorts of technical things, and recently I started to talk a little bit about geopolitics, but that was the first time. Why slavery? And now in episode 47. Well, the reason is that in this section of the channel, the second section of the channel, I look over where we are in the transition from the era of doublings to the coming era. And this section is observational. It's not predictive. Okay, I'm not mathematically focused. I did talk about patterns, and I'm trying to see how our behavior is matching certain mathematical patterns. But the main thing is to just observe where we are and to use our observations to figure out how far we are in that transition. I'm trying to look at and see clearly what is going on around us to see the signs of the times. And we'll have to name, in order to know where we are in the transition, we'll have to see and name where we are. Okay. So I already named a few episodes again our death wish, okay, which in the last 50 years has already claimed at least 2 billion of us, and may well claim further billions. So, and it's natural that we should name slavery, since it has returned, and it's now just as strong as it ever was. We just don't recognize it, because from our history books we know what slavery is. It's that thing that happened in Africa and North and South America, and in the slave ships in between. So, but we're very inventive, and we have lovely ways to depersonalize things and to do things by spreadsheet and at distance, and you don't have to buy and sell people. You don't have to think of specific people. You could sell 1,000 people. It's just a fact. So how did slavery end globally? Let's review how it ended so we can talk about where we are now. First of all, I want to mention again that slave trade between Africa and the Americas was unusually horrific. I can't say, I really don't know why this particular arrangement, why the Europeans and the Africans and the Americans, how it happened, and led by the Europeans, how it happened that they settled on such a horrific way of doing things. I would guess that it has something to do with changes that were underway in Europe already since around 1500. I'll talk a little bit about my guesses about things preceding the era of doublings, the era of exponential growth, and the roots of this era sometime later in this channel, but now is not the place, and I really don't know much about what happened before that era of doublings. But I guess it wasn't an accident. I bet that this is an expression of things that were already on their way for centuries before. But the end of slavery was a direct consequence of exponential growth, of our doublings. We didn't end slavery until we began our doublings. Okay. So, to review, the Newcomen steam engine, it was absolutely revolutionary. It completely, it's the source of all the modern transformations. We figured out how to use fire to get all sorts of things done, move things and to knit and to move water, to anyway, to make cloth and any of a million other things. That happened in 1712. We translated, we figured out how to translate fire and the energy that comes in fire into moving machines and moving things around. And that was the source of, it was about 60 years later, around 1770, 1780, I guess, that the exponential growth, the doublings of our energy consumption began. So that started in England, and most of these, and for the first 50 years, the doublings of our energy consumption were local to England. Then it began to spread to Germany, to America, and to France, and then later to the rest of the world. But at first it was in England. In England at the time, it had taken advantage of its ability to use fire, and its leadership in this energy consumption, and it had cemented an empire stretching across the world. Okay. And extremely powerful and extremely influential. But these doublings started at least by 1775 or so, and by 1808 the English saw that they had a path to wealth and power which did not involve slaves. They had machines instead. Okay. So in fact, you could think of the machines as being something like energy slaves. That's a recent author, Nikki Foruk, wrote a book titled The Energy of Slaves, and he means specifically that. For instance, a compact car that might have 140 horsepower in its engine means it would have, that's the same as, well, horsepower is roughly the same amount of power as 8 full-strength, able-bodied men pulling it as hard as they can. So the amount of work being done for you as you're being pulled down the highway is that of more than 1,000 men. Okay, all harnessed to your little car. So it's immense. Okay, well, the English discovered that they didn't need slaves. Okay, so in 1808 they outlawed the slave trade. This was already 30 years after their doublings began. They knew they were on their way to success. They were already immensely powerful. It was because of that they had the leeway not yet to end slavery, but to end the slave trade in their own holdings. Okay, they weren't ending the slave trade worldwide yet. Okay, this was the slave trade in English lands. Okay. On the other hand, even though they did in 1808 outlaw the slave trade, they still had invented new horrors, such as poor houses where poor people were housed and then forced to work, awful factories, child labor in these factories, and booming cities full of tenements, slums, or newly constructed apartment buildings with people living in squalor inside them. Okay, this was the time of Charles Dickens. It was a time when socialism and communism were invented, and many people were trying to do good works and doing wonder for these just appalling conditions. So even though in 1808 the British did outlaw the slave trade, they were still having things that I would consider forms of slavery very much on their spectrum. So the stories that you hear, like Oliver Twist, this comes from that era. Slave trade was already outlawed, but you still had appalling conditions. Now, England was doubling its energy consumption at least every 22 years, and it was getting richer and richer and more powerful and more powerful. And And finally, around between 1834 and 1843, England abolished slavery. So English could no longer hold slaves. Fine. And then going further, for many decades after that, the UK, which was the ruler of the seas, it had a navy that dominated the seas worldwide. It carried on a global war against the whole slave trade worldwide. Okay. Any slaver was fair game, and they went after them. They hunted them down, destroyed them. So that's how slavery ended worldwide. You had a particular country that didn't need slaves anymore. They also knew in their hearts slavery was wrong, or many of them did. And gradually, over a period of many decades and ever multiplying wealth, they progressively eradicated slavery from their own land, but still retaining other things such as servants and poorhouses and so on. And then, as it happened, they were also dominant worldwide, so they were able to eradicate slavery worldwide. Of course, there are other events that I'm glossing over. I'm just telling you my main point here is that slavery, the reason why it ended, it would not have ended if we had not been doubling our worldwide energy consumption every 22 years. There were many other reasons that went into it. There were whole wars, such as the American Civil War. But that doubling was crucial. The new glut of energy was crucial. If you didn't have the glut of energy, then you really need people's hands and their brawn. Okay. But what that means is that the absence of slavery is a best practice. It's one of the things that we think we invented, that we've figured out about how to properly run society, and that we think is crucial for the ongoing success of our society, along with, say, democracy, capitalism, or you could say socialism, literacy, hospitals, modern science, all these disciplines and ideas about how things, freedom, different kinds of freedoms, different kinds of human rights, international banks, ways of organizing charity, and so on. International law, local law, universal suffrage, women being able to vote. All these best practices. This is what I call best practices, and I introduced the idea very early in the first episodes of this channel. We think that these, if we implement these best practices properly, then we'll continue to have a way forward for continued growth. Okay. And the absence of slavery is one of those best practices. It's something that we invented well after, that we implemented worldwide well after the beginning of our era of doublings. Okay. Now the best practices, since we know that the era of doublings is ending, okay, and has to end. There's no way to keep on doubling indefinitely. Okay, the best practices actually do not ensure our continued prosperity. It's an illusion. They may be wonderful ideas. They may be absolutely right. For instance, I believe it's absolutely right to not hold slaves. Okay, but and to not allow that. Okay, but the idea that they ensure that this sort of democracy or capitalism or whatever your recipe is for 100 or 1,000 different things that society is supposed to do in order to keep us in shape and moving forward. The fact is, none of them together or individually ensure that we're going to continue growing. We aren't going to continue growing. And in fact, our continued growth is often used as a motivation for practicing the best practices. Like you say, well, if you don't have a democracy, you're unlikely to continue growing. Therefore, if you want to continue growing, have a democracy. Same. So we're going to have to find some other reason to avoid slavery and also to practice the other best practices like democracy besides growth, right? The growth is going to end, and then we'll have to ask ourselves, well, if we aren't getting our multiplications every 22 years, if our children are not richer than their parents, then do I really care so much about whether everyone is literate? Okay. If you see an immediate benefit for doing things right, then you're more likely to do it right. If the benefit goes away, then are you going to still do things right? I don't know. So there are reasons why we, for instance, for thousands of years allowed much of our population to not be literate, or we held much of our population in slavery, or why we had monarchies or dictatorships, which is not the same thing as a monarchy necessarily. Okay, there are reasons, and for some people those reasons will be strong because they stand to profit from them. Okay, and everything is going to be reconsidered. Every single one of those best practices is going to be reconsidered, and there will be conflict, ongoing conflict about what to do. And if we do manage to, for instance, avoid having slaves in the future, it will come as a result of purifying our resolve and our motives. Right? We'll just say, okay, regardless of if we were going to avoid having slaves long term, then we would have to say, well, regardless of whether this makes us double every 22 years or double at all, regardless of whether this makes us monetarily or successful, we are just not going to have slaves because that's the right thing to do, or maybe we'll find yet more reasons not to have slaves. Okay, we'll have to rethink our motivations. Okay, and this will be especially a struggle concerning slavery, because in a world where energy is no longer multiplying every 22 years, and in fact we have a little bit less energy, maybe half the energy that we have right now, human hands and brawn will regain a value that they haven't had for hundreds of years. We'll need that work done by humans in a way that we didn't when we could just flip a switch or burn a gallon of gasoline. So let me talk about the several forms of slavery today. I'll talk about 6 of them. Okay. One is a kind of long-distance globalized slavery, and this is the immediate reason why we're talking about slavery in episode 47, right after episode 46, where I talked about global shell games, where one country or several countries pay for their goods that they receive from other countries, pay for them in dollars, okay, which have in fact they're not even printed dollars most often, okay, and other countries give them all sorts of supplies, all sorts of goods, and in particular the U.S. has been the predominant one for receiving goods and giving dollars in return, and there's no intent really to repay those to someday, for the U.S. to someday give goods to the countries that it's received goods from. Okay, there's no intent really in a serious way for the U.S. to pay off its dollar debt. Okay, and there is a certainty that if some countries or some parties decided to throw a wrench in the works and to in some way slow or end the flow of goods to the U.S. or in some way contribute to the devaluation of the dollar so that dollars wouldn't be considered worth so much, that the response from the United States would be violence. Okay. It's certain. In fact, it's proven The U.S. has done it and will continue to do it. Um, and that means that there are billions of people around the world, distributed through many, many countries, who are supplying goods to the United States and to some other countries, who, if they had the same benefits, if they had the same vacations, the same restricted working hours, the same safety, the same, same unemployment arrangements, and the same wages as people in the U.S. have, and in other rich countries have, if they had all of that, then these people, then the goods that the U.S. imports and uses and depends upon, the prices of those goods would multiply by 5 or 10 or 20. So the socks that an American buys, practically everything that you buy at the store, excepting maybe food, is produced somewhere else. And all of that would multiply by 5 or 10 or 20. And you can be sure that if there were an effort to ensure that those workers in those other countries did receive those kinds of wages and so on, and those kinds of benefits and working hours, and anything that would contribute to multiplying the price of goods in America by 5 or 10 or 20, you can be sure that the response would be violence. So, and moreover, these billions of people, they supply every need of an American citizen, but for almost all of them, they just can never come and join. They cannot even visit. Okay, so you have billions of people somewhere else supplying every need and getting paid almost nothing, with no liberty to move. Okay, this is slavery. It's returned to the world, and it's bigger and stronger than ever. It's a worldwide organized thing. It spans the world, and it involves billions of people. So I had to say something about that, because I discussed this arrangement of dollars for goods in the last episode, and here I have to say this is slavery. Okay, it's a globalized slavery system. It's one where there are two ways it can work. Okay, I actually lived in Beijing from 2010 to 2013, and I'll talk about the Chinese model, what I understand of it. Okay, and I noticed while I was there in Beijing that, in America, there are so many goods, books, and candles for your house, or every kind of furniture, every kind of decoration, anything, things that fill needs that you didn't know that you had, filling the American grocery stores and shopping malls and online trading sites, and these goods were not available for the Chinese citizens roaming around Beijing, okay, except for smartphones and luxury clothing. If they felt like buying those, they could get those, but all these other millions of kinds of items that are available to everyone in the U.S. just were not available in Beijing, and it seemed like the public was unaware that others had all these luxuries. Okay, who knows why? Probably the TV is controlled or something. They didn't seem particularly anxious to obtain these luxuries for themselves. They didn't fill their houses with all sorts of interesting trinkets and things the way that Americans do. And also the hospitals, the offices, the stores. It was already an immensely rich country, and this capital of an immensely rich country, and all of these you walk into a storefront or into a hospital, and it all looked a little cheap and shabby, and it looked really packed, and leading hospitals of the country looked very packed and old and cheap and shabby. Now maybe their equipment was good. I didn't find out about the quality of their equipment, but certainly the buildings were not great. Okay, and so, and more recently, China is implementing a program of government surveillance with cameras all over the streets and AI, and they can notice somebody doing something that is off limits on the street and immediately shame that person, maybe crossing the street at the wrong time, okay, by flashing lights saying so and so just crossed the street at the wrong time. Okay, so that's a Chinese model, okay, of organizing something like slavery. Okay, I actually like China a lot. Okay, but I just have to call a spade a spade. Okay. I mean, if this is slavery, it's a soft form of slavery, but softer certainly than the African American slave trade. Okay, but it certainly has many of the aspects of it. Okay. Another Now China is an exception. Okay, the more typical thing for other, China only supplies maybe a quarter of the American of the things that America is buying. Okay, America does think a lot about the threat from China, but in fact it's buying from all over the world. There are many other poor countries that are supplying goods to America and to other rich countries, and in these poor countries, the large majority, 99 point some percent of the population does without the same goods that the Chinese do without. Okay, and the largest shopping mall in a country may be as large as a single store in the United States, say a Target. Not as big as a shopping mall, not as big as a department store. It's a single story. That's the largest shopping mall in a country, maybe like that. Okay, again, in these countries, there's liberty is restricted. People can't liberty to do all sorts of things, to move, to do all sorts of activities. But in this case, the reason why liberty is restricted is not because of strict rules. It's because of poverty and its consequences. These people are just so poor that they can't do all sorts of things. They can't move from place to place. They can't go to college. They can't feed their children anything except rice and beans, whatever. Okay. But I think both models, the Chinese model and the more typical model, are really both models of globalized slavery are really at the root pretty much the same. Okay. The reason why they work is that rich countries insist on receiving a lot and giving as little as possible in return, and that's really crucial. And they enforce this arrangement by using a combination of soft power and military power, and the rich countries give the money that is given, the U.S. dollars that are given to these countries, either to China or to the poor countries. They give their money not to workers, but to ruling classes and to multinational corporations. So they leave it to the ruling classes and the multinational corporations to organize everything about getting work done for almost nothing. Okay. It's up to them. It's up to the ruling classes and corporations of these countries, whether it's China or some other country, to figure out how to get work done for nothing, how to strong arm and force millions of people to do their work, any way that is chosen, and they can be inventive as they like about arranging this, and that way the people back in the United States and other countries get to say, oh, this is not slavery, wash your hands of it. Okay. And another key point is that the rich countries do not allow immigration of the workers, and they don't allow, and even in some cases where they might allow a worker to come in, they certainly aren't going to allow the worker's family to come in. I mean, it can happen, but it's a lot harder to arrange for the worker's family to come in than to arrange for a worker. That's even though the workers in these countries, more often than not, are just desperate to leave, and they're willing to sacrifice anything to leave. When you have people who so much dislike their situation that they're willing to get on a raft meant for 100 and stack it up with 500 people and with no motor or one small motor, and then hope that they manage to cross the Mediterranean from Africa to, say, Italy, knowing that their chances of dying are great, and they still go. Okay, this is a sign that something is really, I mean, that they're living in something approximating slavery. Or I'll discuss more about I'll give other examples. Okay. So we can compare this to the slave trade. Okay, the one between Africa and the Americas. Okay, that slave trade over the centuries that it went on, maybe tens of millions, 20 or 30 million slaves were traded. Okay, whereas now we have billions involved in what's going on now. Okay. So now is, in terms of numbers, much worse. Okay. Now there are some advantages to the current form that to some extent or other the people working in these countries, the supplier countries, get to retain their families, their nationalities, and their culture. That's not absolutely, in fact, often these are also distorted or limited or even removed, even within a country. Okay, but often it does happen that you can stay living in your own home or somewhere close to your family home and go to work and be around your children and your wife. Okay. Now there are other forms of slavery and servitude over the centuries, many others that had the same advantage. Okay, so this doesn't mean that you're not a slave. Okay, it's just, and but there's a but something that these people, say in China or in Latin America or in Africa, don't get is they have no interaction with the people they're serving. They receive no recognition and no respect. Okay, so they are not human. The people in America who buy these things at Walmart just don't know that these people exist, and they don't know where these things come from. It's far more dehumanizing than what was done in past versions of slavery. And moreover, if you stay in your home country, which often enough is dirt poor, then you don't have the advantages that a slave would have once they arrived, say in the United States or or Europe, or in other systems of slavery. People who were slaves tended to be from that country where they were still working as a slave. There was some slave trade, but very often the slaves were from the same country that they were born in. They were working in the same. They were not traded from one country to another. That's okay. So here, with this current arrangement, the people working, say, in Nicaragua or in the Congo, these people don't have any possibility of advancement for themselves or for their family. Okay, if they were working in the country where their products were being delivered, then just by residing in that country, they would have some possibility of advancement for themselves and their children. and they would also have the safety of that country. So, you know, America hasn't had a war on its own territory since the Civil War 150 years ago. Europe, until very recently, had some 70 or 80 years without war, without any major war. Um, and and these countries are being, you know, it would be a huge advantage for somebody if they could actually live in that place and work hard, even for a slave. If a slave were there, I'm not saying that you should have slavery at all or anything. I'm just saying that there is an advantage for people if they can be around the people that they're serving. The people that they're serving know who they are, and if they're able to, just by living there, find ways to, say, pick up the local language. Maybe their children can have a better education. Maybe there could even be a marriage with one of the citizens. You know, there are advantages to being there. Okay. So there are pros and cons about the modern form of globalized slavery. It's also a disaster for the rich, right? Because the rich people who are consuming all these goods, they're living in a fantasy world where they think as if the things that they consume were their own creation. Okay. They think that they truly deserve, and they worked hard during their 40-hour workday to get all the goods that they fill their houses with. Okay, they don't even know all the other work that was done on their behalf and who the people were. So any possible relationship between the supplier and the consumer is just stillborn, and the relationship that could happen is absent, and the rich drown in luxury, consumed by addictions and so on. So there are pros and cons, and I don't know. Overall, this globalized slavery often is a bit softer, right? But it still has a steel grasp on these people, and it has some advantages and some terrible disadvantages. So I said I was going to tell you about 6 forms of slavery. That's the first, and I'll go over the other 5 in much less detail, and I will mention many of these again in later episodes. Okay. Another one is immigrant slavery, immigrant labor, which today involves hundreds of millions of people worldwide. They may come in seasonally into a country and leave, or they may come and stay long term, maybe with no citizenship, no papers, and no family. They can't bring their family, and they can't return often enough. So the arrangement is that a company or an employer, imports somebody, and the arrangement is that if they would like to go back and see their family, that employer won't bring them back. Won't go through whatever hoops they would need to do to bring that person back. So that person just stays indefinitely, sending money perhaps back to their family, but unable to go anywhere. So I think that this form, the one where people stay long term without papers, without citizenship, and required to stay in place and not really legal, so that they're only there under the protection of a particular employer. I think that this is just as inhuman as a slave trade, as the African American slave trade. I've known people who couldn't return to their wife and children for 20 years. A woman who within a year after she gave birth to her daughter had left and didn't see her daughter for more than 10 years. I've known somebody who was away from his wife and children for 20 years and received word that and perhaps was in contact with them with video, maybe even I don't know how often, but at some point he learned that his wife was dying in the hospital, and he didn't go back. He couldn't go back because he would have lost his job and could not support his family. We've known another man who his wife, who had several young children, um, was in a car accident and was in a wheelchair and required many surgeries, and he couldn't go back. I've known many families who, in the U.S., if you marry an American, then you can become a citizen, and then you can progressively request that your children and then various relatives, cousins, grandparents become citizens, and it takes 10 years of waiting for one of those, and then you just work you work it and you keep on working it. So if you may spend 50 years bringing first a grandparent or two grandparents, and then some sisters, and then the sister's spouses and children, and then relatives. The family is continuously dismembered, and never in one, and it really distorts the family. And I think this is just, I can't, I think these are unspeakably wrong, these arrangements. At any rate, and that's immigrant labor. The people in these countries who are, especially if they're living without papers, have no rights and no legal status. They're manipulated. They're practically speaking owned. They cannot have their own culture, and if you're living there and you can't go back to your family, then you're you make your entire life, the remaining 30, 40, 50 years of your life into kind of living Holocaust. You just throw yourself away so that you can keep sending the money back to your family. So that's the second form of slavery, immigrant labor. The third one is to have lower or segregated classes within a country. So things like gated communities, where the privileged stay inside their gated community and the poor are somewhere else. Apartheid. You can have live-in labor. I've seen that done in many. I think it's common in many countries. You can have class systems. And right now, many of these are kind of frowned upon in the United States. Well, gated communities are fine in the United States already. These other things are not so accepted, but I think they will become much more attractive in the United States and in other rich countries as energy becomes scarce. We may see countries splitting apart into states or zones for workers and other zones for the rich, or maybe cities will be the province of the rich. So we may see geographical boundaries developing in the coming decades. A fourth form of slavery is top-down control. Centralized power. And I'm talking about somewhere above and beyond totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is something where a good fraction, maybe a quarter of the population, is so invested in some particular vision that they're willing to assist the state in supervising every detail of everyone's life and making sure everyone stays in line. Okay, but now we have, as always, we have efforts to rule simply by power, even without that quarter of the population. You can still do a lot using the strength that fossil fuel and electricity that already sort of those both tend to centralize power in the hands of whoever has the fossil fuels or whoever produces the electricity. And now we have technology and video and AI for controlling people, watching them. And manipulating them. A fifth form of slavery, you'll recall that I mentioned that systems of debt always lead in one way or another eventually to systems of slavery. There's something going on right now, and perhaps it's already mostly complete in the United States and in other countries where the by far the large majority of United States citizens are being turned into debt slaves. Okay, they just can't stay out of debt. I discussed this a bit in the last, I think the episode before last. And just by necessity, you have to be in debt. Just to have a house, just to have some place to live, just to be able to pay your bills, you end up in debt. And meanwhile, rule of law is becoming less and less sure in many countries, many of the richer countries. Government services and other social structures are becoming less reliable, less functional, and so you have people living, and I'll discuss this more in later episodes. You have people who are used to a certain security and certain social services, a certain way of life, and certain standards of education, and who did not traditionally live continuously in debt, and now they're already submerged in debt. There's no way to get out, and meanwhile, the government isn't delivering what they depend on. The police aren't there for them when they need them, and the education system isn't what it was, and so on. Okay, so this is when people are practically speaking owned because they're in debt and there's no way to get out of debt. That's a sign that you're moving along the spectrum into slavery. And many Americans are already pretty far along there, and I think in many other countries too. And the sixth form of slavery, though I think this is a stretch, I'm not sure exactly. I'm not. It's somewhere bordering on. It's an interior slavery. It's the phenomenon of addiction and of poverty and of consumerism that people don't have the self-control or whatever it is to control their activities and their spending and their consumption, and they always want more and more and more. And this is the fuel of exponential growth today. It has been for the last 100 years of just the common man always wanting more and doing whatever you can to get it. And if you can't regulate yourself, then you're a slave to something inside yourself, except for that something inside yourself is being deliberately promoted and trained by the society around you. You're being trained to be a good consumer. You're trained to be a good addict. Okay, it doesn't matter which addiction, but I don't think it matters to the people. It matters to you. Just need to, if you need something, that's good enough. You can be manipulated and controlled. So those are the 6 forms of slavery that I think are in play today, and I'm sure you could think of others. Probably you could. That's just where I ran out. I have a few overall comments. First of all, is all the other best practices, as I said, all the other things that we think are key to modern society and function are in an analogous position where they're all in question, and they'll all be in question as we go through this transition. Another comment I have is that humans have always struggled with slavery, and there's nothing new if we're practicing slavery again. Okay, what is unusual is that for a century we were without it. It was a really special time. I wish it had gone on. Another thing, I've done this whole episode on slavery, and I'm aware that many people make this into make this topic and into an agenda for all of their affairs and for the human race, so that there's talk about repaying debt from slavery 200 years ago and so on, and identifying certain people like Europeans as bad, and Americans as bad, and Africans as good, and trying to invert the social structure. And I'm not going to go in that direction. I think it's fruitless. If you analyze, if you use this framework, this axis of power and injustice, analyzing where the power is exercised and what's unjust, and you use this as your key to understanding all of human affairs and what to do about them, you will always be misled. Okay. If you just analyze people and society exclusively this way, thinking about justice and injustice, about power and lack of power, then everything will fall apart in your fingers. Okay, things will always go sideways. Okay, because human life is far more rich than that. Okay, for instance, I mean, one major point is that the unjust, the people who are committing injustices, they ruin themselves. They ruin their lives day by day by living a life that like, for instance, the consumerist who lives in a fantasy life, receiving gifts or receiving goods from people that they don't even know exist. Okay, that they could have had a much better life if they hadn't relied on that. Okay, and day by day it would have been better, and long term it all crumbles and all falls apart, and you end up, your society crumbling, yourself an addict, and your children. Yeah. So that while it's important to talk about modern slavery, it's not the key to the human race. Another comment is that we are coming to an era where we're unable to double our energy, and we'll have a little less energy than we have now. More hands will be needed, and there will be more of a pull towards slavery. Okay, but equally, and I think that this is always true, we'll have to rely on individuals and families who know a particular place well. If you want to get the best results you want to get the best work done, then you need people who really know their situation. They know their land, they know who they can trade with, they know who's and either traders, businessmen, landowners, farmers. Those people have to know their particular situation really well and have to be able to act with agency. Okay. So if you care about getting things efficiently, if energy is not cheap, you need a lot of people with agency. In fact, everybody needs to have agency to get the best results from them, to get the best products, and so you can't. What I'm saying is that, and I'll develop this in a lot more depth in later episodes. But I think when you really need energy, when you really need resources, and you don't have much energy to give for them, you cannot. Slavery systems are not. The more extreme the slavery, the worse results you'll get. The best results are when people have more agency. So, in other words, that having less energy, sure, you need more hands, you need more brawn. At the same time, you need more agency. So I don't think that we're slipping into it. We have to go in the direction of slavery. I think we could do without the slavery we have now. We could, and I hope we will find ways to do that. Okay, that wraps it up for this episode. Have a great week. If you know anybody who would be interested in this content, please invite them to join in. Thank you for your attention, and have a wonderful week. Keep coming back.